I think Christians don't. I was myself a Christian for 23 years, essentially. They already feel like they've got it figured out. Paul had the right message. We read Paul's epistles and stuff. When I first left Christianity, I was having these conversations in person and online with Christian friends and other Christians I knew. And I would quote a line from Jesus, such as, "Forgive your enemies 70 times 7. And then why do you think God wouldn't do that if Jesus told us to do that? And they would always quote a passage from Paul to rebut me. It's like, are you rebutting Jesus with Paul? Every single time. And it became more clear to me that this religion is really Paulianity, it's not Christianity. Paul's version of Jesus, who Paul never met Jesus in person, never heard Jesus teach in person, only heard secondhand knowledge about Jesus, and was a persecutor of Christians, killed hundreds, maybe thousands of Christians before his famous encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus, where he has this vision. And I think Paul's first vision of Jesus was probably a genuine one, because when you read the account in the book of Acts, essentially a bright light throws Paul off of his horse while he's traveling to Damascus to kill more Christians. And he says, Paul, or his name was Saul at that point, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he's blinded by this light, and he's like, who are you, Lord? He says, I am Jesus the Nazarene, whom you are persecuting. And then he tells Paul to go to a certain house to meet a certain guy who's going to heal his blindness, because he strikes Paul blind by the light. And to me, I'm like, that sounds like a pretty genuine encounter with a light being. But what happens is Paul has two more visionary experiences with Jesus over the next few years and decades. And he goes on to say, oh, I met Jesus in another vision, and then a third vision, and Jesus told me the real gospel, which is that Jesus himself was the final animal sacrifice of God, and that Jesus's murder on God's behalf was the final atonement. And all you have to do is just confess with your mouth, I believe you died for my sins. Boom, you're saved. That's all you have to do. Signed, sealed, delivered. And the problem is that's very different than Jesus's gospel that he actually taught in those red letters when he lived and walked on earth. And that was one of the first things that started to rub me wrong about Christianity. I was a worship leader, right? I was a pastor's son my whole life. I'm around Christians 24/7, and I noticed we don't seem to care very much about the middle part. We care a lot about the virgin birth and a lot about the crucifixion and resurrection. But those red letters in those years in between the birth and death of Christ, we don't give a whole lot of credit to in comparison. And then we get obsessed over what Paul said about Jesus, but he never met Jesus. And he actually very much condemned and called the apostles hypocrites. He called them so-called apostles. He says they mean nothing to me in Galatians. So